In the last lecture, we added some dynamic yet still static data to the index.view file in the pages folder. Now, at this point here, this is working, but of course, in a real app, we typically load that data from some server. So if we render a list of posts, we fetch that from a database. And we need to connect to that database or to a RESTful API that does this before we can display the posts. And that's still the case for a Nuxt app because, as I mentioned earlier, Nuxt is not a server-side framework like Express. You don't really have code in Nuxt where you would connect to a database and do that. But there are some ways of running some code on the server instead of in the client, which is what's happening right now. Right now, everything runs on the client here, but we can change that. Now, in a normal Vue app, we would fetch data in the created lifecycle hook, for example. We can add it by simply adding this method to our instance object, to our component instance object. And now let's say loaded posts is actually an empty post, an empty array initially. So I cut out the posts here. And in created, let's simulate that we reach out to a server. And for that, I'll use a timer. Now, of course, this is just a timer because I want to simulate that we reach out to a server. So there's no deeper sense to this. So let's say after 1.5 seconds, our results are there. And hence, this arrow function gets executed. So that's the normal set timeout function. Here, we could then reach out to loaded posts and assign an array which holds the 2 posts we previously directly assigned in data. If we save this and we reload this page, you see it loads instantly and the posts are there after 2 seconds, or 1.5 seconds. This works, but it has one big downside. The posts get loaded on the client, and this is really important. This is now not happening on the server. We get the page immediately, as you can see by the fact that the bottom part is empty, but the top part is populated, and thereafter it's loaded after this initial page has been rendered. To the user, this might be fine because we could show a spinner instead of that white empty area. The problem is, if we're talking about search engine optimization, we're not fixing the issue of the crawler not seeing anything, because the crawler only looks at the initial page. And if we inspect the source code of that initial page, we see that we got nothing on that page. It would be this empty section here. So that, of course, is not that great. Would be better if we could actually fetch the data on the server and wait for it to be fetched before we send back the then finished page to the client. The created lifecycle hook clearly doesn't work as we saw. So what else does work? Well, there is a special property, a special method actually, we can use in page components, and that is important, only in components in the pages folder, that Nuxt will execute on the server. And that's the async data method. Now it's pretty much the same as the normal data method, this one. It in the end has to return an object which will be the data of this component and hence the data you can use in the template. But, and that is important, async data is executed on the server, and if we execute an asynchronous task there, like waiting for a timer or more realistic, reaching out to a backend, to a server, then it will wait for this task to finish before it returns the page to the client. Hence, we will get a pre-rendered and complete page back to the client. Now that is really important. Nuxt will only call this method in pages though. So if you add it in a component in one of your other components, like in a layout or in the components folder, this will simply not be executed and it will not work correctly. You also shouldn't use normal data then to override something you plan on returning here, because this will execute on the client, so it would override whatever you return here, and you could get unwanted effects. So let me comment out data here, and now let's simply put our timer code into async data. The problem just is, here we need to return a JavaScript object. So let's temporarily replace this. And let's now make sure that we don't just set this loaded post equal to that, this won't work, but that instead we return a JavaScript object where we have a loaded posts property, which value is this array, and hence we need to close this object after the closing squared brackets. Now, one important note, that this keyword here, this, does not work as expected in async data because async data runs before this component is actually created. That's the idea behind it. So if you try to access a method or a field from the normal data or anything like that, this will not give you the view component instance. You won't be able to access your methods and so on because the component has not been created yet. This is really important, that this keyword does not work like this here. You can't access your finished view component instance because it is not finished yet. So what we're doing now is we're executing this timeout function and we're returning a JavaScript object which holds our loaded posts. Now let's save this and let's execute this again. And we get an error. Now why is that? The reason is simple. We need to give async data an idea about when we're done. Otherwise, if it doesn't get that idea, it will immediately just return the finished page. Now, how do we give this idea to async data? One solution is to use a promise. You instantly have to return a promise here, a new promise maybe, into which you wrap your async code. And if you're using a library like Axios, which we will use later, for making HTTP requests, that will automatically give you promises which you then can simply return. Because if you return a promise, then async data will take that promise and kind of listen to it to be resolved and render the page once it is resolved. The alternative is that you use a callback. To async data, you actually get an argument, the context. We'll have a look at this in a second. And the second argument you can get is a callback method you can execute. You execute it once you're done. The execution of that method then also tells the async data method that you're done. So what you can do is you can go into set timeout, and here where I return these posts, instead of returning that, I execute a callback method, and in that callback method I either pass an error if it occurred, say if you want to handle an error returned by your HTTP client, or if you don't get an error, you pass null. And the second argument now actually is the JavaScript argument that will be your data once you're done. So that will become your data you can access from your client. So with this restructured, we're calling the callback inside the setTimeout function. And in callback, I'm passing a JavaScript object with the loaded posts as the answer or as the second argument, and this will therefore become the data we can access from within our template or anywhere else in this view component once it has been rendered. Now let's save this file and see this in action. If I reload this page, let's click the reload button here. It actually takes 2 seconds or 1.5 seconds. Here, let's see, it takes a bit, but then it reloads because now it waits for the async code to finish on the server and then gives us the finished page. And we can check this by inspecting the page source code. Now here at the bottom, we actually see our post data as part of the source code because we get the finished page sent back from the server and not as before, just the page where we need to load the data asynchronously in the client. Now this happens on the server, and this is way more search engine friendly because now the crawler sees what you see.